Welcome everyone to part two of our Trans Ohio Cultural Competency training that we're having today. I wanted to be able to introduce our speaker. Mr. James Knapp was born and raised in Northeastern Ohio. James has been a member of the Trans Ohio Board of Directors since 2013. He's a lifelong activist. James first got involved in trans advocacy in 2002 when he spoke to the Akron Public School Board concerning its policy on gender variant individuals, dress codes, and bullying. Since that time, he's been involved with a local, state, and national organization. He continues to speak and educate others on the complex issues facing the LGBTQ communities, focusing on concerns specific to transgender and gender variant individuals. He has spoken to students, teachers, guidance counselors, social workers, medical professionals, and attorneys, both at private training and conferences. James has a Bachelor of Arts in English and Philosophy from the University of Akron and a Juris Doctor from Cooley Law School. We welcome James to our training today, and I will turn it over to him.
Awesome. Good morning, folks. Glad everyone was able to come back today. I appreciate your time. I know it's kind of lunch. Again, my name is James. I use he, him pronouns, and this is part two of cultural competency. I'm going to start off with some terms again, because, this is very important. So I know we went over this last time, but just to reiterate, there's some basic terms you should know. The first is sex, which is a classification of biological organisms, usually based on physical and physiological attributes. Usually this is based, just on reproductive anatomy, gene expressions, and hormone functions at birth. Sex is usually only categorized as male or female, which is what we call the binary, because in computer language we have zeros and ones. So anything that only has two categories we consider binary. But there's a pretty wide variation in human biology and across the whole animal kingdom. There's more than just two sexes, and that's recognized not just in modern science, but multiple cultures and religions. Next, there's gender. This is a socially constructed identity based on pre-assigned roles, based on presumed sex assigned at birth. So there is a difference in gender and sex if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. But honestly, I'm going to use sex and gender interchangeably, and most people do. Next up, we have sex assigned at birth. Again, this is a classification of people based on physical descriptions as either male or female or intersex. In most states, Ohio included, there's only two options for gender on birth certificates. So there's male, female. But in a lot of circumstances, and I'm saying like 1% of the population, sex is not readily determinable at birth. So in Ohio, we used to have an O option, which was for other, but we no longer have that option. Mainly because cisgender parents of infants were offended by the O. So they usually went to courts to have this remedied to either male or female option. But, 7 U.S. jurisdictions now offer some form of a non-binary identification on birth certificates. And this is important not just for trans people, but also intersex people who may not identify as male or female, or whose identity can't be conformed at birth. And that's true, again, for 1% of the general population. So it's a lot more people than we think about. Gender identity is one's most internal sense of their own gender, regardless of their sex assigned at birth. For most people, their gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. If that's the case, you're cisgender. But again, gender identity can be male, female, neither, both, or another gender. So there's lots of ways to experience gender identity. Everyone has a gender identity, even you. Last time we went over how we express our gender identities and how we don't usually think about genders in terms of ourselves, even though, we experience our gender through the whole way we perceive the world. So even though you may not necessarily think about your gender identity on a regular basis, like some trans people do, as cisgender people, you're still, perceiving the world in in a very gendered lens. The way people interact with you is often based on the way they perceive you as either male or female. And this is, mostly innate behaviors that people aren't really even conscious of. So again, if you are cisgender, that just means you are not transgender. It's a neutral descriptor. It's not a bad word. And although most people do identify as cisgender, that doesn't mean it's weird or abnormal to be trans or not cis. On the other side of cisgender is transgender, and the easiest way to define that is just not cis. Trans can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's really an umbrella term, and it just means that someone's gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. There's lots of different ways to be trans, and the majority of trans youth now identify as non-binary. So that's existing outside of the gender binary. And again, that word means a lot of different things to different people, and it's changing over time. In 2013, when I started working with non-binary community members, non-binary was a very specific gender description, and it meant someone who didn't feel either male or female. But now non-binary has become more of an umbrella term, and there's lots of different ways to be non-binary. And that's really interesting to me because, in the 1990s, genderqueer was the word. And genderqueer was also like a political identity. But we don't use genderqueer in the same way we do. Now we use non-binary, and they're kind of the same community members, but it's also a different identity because it's not as political as genderqueer was. There's also bigender, which is feeling both male and female at the same time, which is the non-native version of two-spirits. And I know a lot of folks grew up learning that two-spirit and bisexual were interchangeable. That's not true. That's not the case. Two-spirit is the Native American description of someone who feels either male and female at the same time, or they live their life between maleness and femaleness. And in a lot of Native tribes, what that means is people's genders is kind of fluid, and it changes through the seasons and even the seasons of their lives. So it's very possible for a Native person to grow up more female presenting and then go through a male puberty and then live their adult life between maleness and femaleness. And that is part of their culture, and it's nothing abnormal or strange. Whereas here in, the non-native America, we don't necessarily think of gender that way. And we have been brought up to, really culturalize maleness and femaleness. And that's really something that we start taking in at infancy. There are very specific onesies made for boys and very specific onesies made for girls. And, that's really forced on us as soon as we enter the world. But when we talk about trans people, I want you to remember that language is always changing. And in the 90s, we used the word transsexual, and that word was a very specific kind of trans person. It usually implicated surgical. Here's my cat already. I said the cats were going to come out. Surgical intervention or also hormones, but we don't use the term transsexual anymore. It's a outdated medical term. Even folks who in the community use the word transsexual to describe themselves, it's usually preferred as allies if you don't use the term transsexual and just use the term trans. So as cis allies, always use trans. We don't use words like transvestite anymore. Please, if you hear that, correct your friends and associates. Again, intersex people are folks whose hormones, chromosomes, or physical anatomy don't match up with what is considered like traditionally masculine or feminine. There's lots of different ways to be intersex. We used to use the terms hermaphrodite and androgen. We don't use those terms anymore. Please, if you see them, just use intersex. Intersex is not a bad word. So intersex is actually like 1.7% of the population, which is just around the same number as redheads, which is 2%. And it's interesting because a lot of intersex conditions may be undiagnosed or not mentioned in medical charts. And that's for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it's not caught. until the intersex person's trying to conceive and they can't, or until there's an autopsy after death, and they have some kind of internal sex condition that wasn't diagnosed, or sometimes doctors don't want to put it in charts because they know that there is stigma around that and they don't want to upset the patients. Also, sometimes patients who consider who may be intersex, they may not want to be honest about that with their doctors because they think that they may be opening themselves up to discrimination. Because even though intersex is pretty common across the animal kingdom, we don't talk about it and we don't learn about it in schools the way we do, male and female in biology classes. And it's interesting because the majority of intersex people don't realize that they're intersex. And there was a push a couple of years ago to change documentation at the federal level to include male, female, or intersex and transgender. And the trans and intersex communities came together and said no on that because intersex people widely identify as cisgender and do not want their private medical documentation to be included on physical IDs. There's no reason for them to be outing themselves because it really is a medical condition. Surgery on intersex infants is still widely prevalent, and it usually occurs before the infant is 1 year of age. Most of those surgeries are for cosmetic purposes, is just to conform to the typical, you know, physical genitalia. Most often, those surgeries are unnecessary. Sometimes surgery is required if the urethra is affected, but widely the surgery is requested by doctors rather than by patients and their parents, because there is still a real stigma around intersex conditions, and they want the child to grow up feeling normal and looking normal. The problem with that is, those surgeries are unnecessary and they often lead to complications later on down the road. And intersex infants don't have a say in those surgeries. And up until the 90s, these surgeries happened in the US without parental consent. It was actually brought to the attention of the UN, and the Human Rights Commission discussed intersex rights across many countries. If you're interested in that, look up Interact. It's an it's an intersex activist group, and they have a bunch of statistics, and it's really interesting the way this information is tracked across countries, because a lot of countries don't take intersex conditions statistics, and that's kind of true for the U.S. too. The U.S. The census doesn't ask if people are intersex or trans; they just ask male or female, and that's really not illustrative of what our population is. But it is important to note that some intersex people do identify as trans, but most trans people aren't intersex, and most intersex people aren't trans. So it's a very small portion of the communities that overlap. But in terms of rights and the civil rights movements, the communities face the very same challenges. So anything that affects the intersex community is largely going to affect the trans community and vice versa. Does that make sense? Hearing silence, I'll assume yes. Again, that was just a refresher. But how common is gender nonconformity really? Because the way people talk about transgender people and gender nonconforming individuals, it sounds like it's a really new thing, but it's not. Trans people have existed throughout all of history, and we span all continents, all socioeconomical brackets, all ages. We have a variety of medical conditions that also cis people have. We experience the same kind of issues that cis people face, and also a lot more. But when we talk about gender nonconforming people, we don't always mean trans people, and I want that to be very clear. Because when we talk about gender nonconformity, we mean anyone who steps outside of what's traditional gender roles. So a lot of LGBT people are gender nonconforming. That doesn't mean they're trans. So tomboys are gender nonconforming. That doesn't mean they're little trans men. It just means that they're tomboys, and they can have, you know, any sexual orientation. They can be lesbians, bisexuals, or they can be straight. You know, a lot of tomboys grow up to be traditionally like femme, and some don't. So I really want to point out that gender nonconformity changes over a person's lifetime, and it's really based on what's popular or what's considered average at that time. So what was gender nonconforming in the 1920s may not be what's gender nonconforming now. You know, back in the day, men used to wear dresses, and royalty wore high heels. Butchers wore high heels. High heels was a masculine shoe. Women were too weak and fragile to walk in high heels. They had delicate ankles. You know, that's not the case now. You know, if a male is wearing high heels, that's considered gender nonconforming, and it's stuff like that that, you know, kind of illustrates that the way we think about gender has been changing and evolving. You know, the same is true for typical colors. Traditionally, I think all the way back until the 40s, you know, blue was a feminine color. It was a light, delicate blue color. It wasn't masculine at all. But pink was a vibrant and masculine color, and now it's changed. It's flipped. So the way we think about things that are very gendered continues to change, which is interesting because a lot of people think that we are post-gender or post-feminist, and as much as I want to believe that that world is possible, we're not there yet. But you know, like I said before, intersex people and trans people make up a large portion of the general population. Even though it's 1.7% as intersex, that's a huge number, because 0.6% of the population is trans, so it's a smaller population, but that's like 2 million people here just in the US. And again, intersex people and trans people span all continents. We're in all cultures. So please, when you're talking about male and female, don't say biological man or biological woman, because intersex and trans people may not identify as just male or female, but also we're all biological creatures. All humans are biological. So to say that someone is a biological man doesn't differentiate between a trans man or a cis man, because we both have biology. All right. Next up, I have a little activity for y'all. This is from the Trans Student Network. This is the Gender Unicorn, and this is the way educators have been talking about gender identity and expression to trans people and also to cis people. And this came out around the 2000s. It's based on the Transgender Red Man, and it's interesting because it breaks up gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and also attractions. So there's physical attractions, emotional attractions. There's an adult version of this that has sexual attraction on it as well. And I want you all to just take a minute and see where you fit on these scales. Because when we talk about gender and we talk about gender expression, you know, they may not line up 100%, especially considering, you know, how gender roles are changing and how fashion isn't nearly as gendered as it used to be. So your gender identity may be female, but your gender expression may be a little over on in the middle range. That doesn't mean that your sex is different, but your gender expression may not match up with that sex. Does that make sense? Awesome. We're going to take just a minute, and I want everyone to think about where they fit on this scale. So go through gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and then physical attraction. Because again, when a lot of people talk about trans folks, they assume that trans people are all gay or lesbian, and that's not true. Um, just like cis people can experience all kinds of physical and emotional attractions, so can trans people. So just because someone is T doesn't mean they're somewhere in the LGB area too. Which is why I personally hate the LGBT run-on sentence, because I think it doesn't really separate and take into consideration people's different sexual orientations, because trans people aren't necessarily LG or B. They could be straight. Anybody thinking about this activity and thinking you're a little bit more feminine or a little bit more masculine than you thought you were? Anybody notice that maybe you're more emotionally attracted to one gender than another, where maybe you're more physically attracted to another gender? Yeah, it's a spectrum, right? All right, does anyone have any questions about that so far? Excellent. All right, next let's talk about some disparities faced in the trans community, because we're at an interesting point in history where there's more and more legislation being passed and introduced that directly affects the trans community than ever before. Even as visibility is increasing in a positive way, these bills are still coming out. So, just let's think about some disparities that have been facing the trans community, not just today, but through history. First is, worrying about physical safety. You raise your hand here if you've never had to worry about your personal physical safety based on your physical appearance in bathrooms, locker rooms, sex segregated spaces. And sometimes, especially for people who are femme presenting, they can feel pretty unsafe in certain situations. But raise your hand if you don't have to worry about that on a daily basis when you enter any bathroom, any locker room, any sex segregated space. And unfortunately, that's not the reality of the majority of the trans community, especially folks who are early on in transition. Raise your hand if you haven't had to worry about your physical personal safety at a restaurant, going out to a bar with your friends, going grocery shopping, going to Target to try on clothes or look at shoes, just walking through the aisles. Right? What about government buildings? Going to court, having to go get your new having to go get a birth certificate, having to go get a social security card, just having to go file something. Going to libraries, going to theaters, movie theaters, out on the town. Raise your hand if you've never had to worry about your personal physical safety based on your physical appearance. What about seeking medical care, hospitals, doctor's offices, therapist offices? Just going to make an appointment, going to pick up a prescription. You haven't had to worry about your physical safety standing in line waiting for your prescription. Going to school, going to work, when you're a kid hanging out in the playgrounds, as an adult picking up your children. Raise your hand if you haven't had to worry about your personal physical safety in public spaces, parks, walking down the street, standing outside on your own front yard. My screen says 97 hands are up, and I believe that. Unfortunately, that's not the reality faced by a lot of trans people. Even here, I'm in Cleveland. Here in Cleveland since 2004, we have had 6 murders of Black trans women, the majority of whom were within 5 miles of their own home. So when we talk about fear in the trans community, I want people to be aware that it's not because trans people are uncomfortable being trans, or that they are afraid of being themselves. It's that they are afraid of being perceived as transgender in the world, because that world may not be safe for them. Especially based on where they're living. Even here in Ohio, we only have 37 localities that have comprehensive non-discrimination policies and laws. So Well, the majority of Americans and the majority of Ohioans want equal rights for trans and intersex people. Those policies don't exist. So, I don't want to say it's legal to discriminate, but when discrimination happens, there's no legal recourse. There's no remedy there. Raise your hand if you've never been asked about your real name when introducing yourself, or been asked if that's your real pronoun. Even using a nickname. I go by Jay. Sometimes people ask me, what's that stand for? But people never question if I made it up. Raise your hand if you've never been asked what your real gender is, what your real pants is, what's in your pants, what your real sex is, what your body parts look like, if you've had surgery on your genitals, or how you have sex. Right? These are conversations that a lot of people think are appropriate to have with people who they assume are visibly transgender. Strangers will walk up to trans people and ask them how they have sex, what their mother thinks about their life choices, and what's in their pants. What's most concerning to me, not just as a trans activist, but as a human being, is adults are having these conversations with children in public spaces, at school board meetings, for example, when we're talking about bathroom policies and field trip policies. Adults will ask children under 18, what their penis looks like, and that is not ever appropriate, ever. If they're trans, if they're cis, we should not be talking about the genitals of children, especially in open forums like school board meetings. But you would not believe the things that I have seen across the state here in Ohio. All right, last one. Raise your hand if your ID accurately reflects who you are. So your birth certificate, your social security card, your driver's license, state ID, and any kind of badge or work ID you have. If that your face looks like your face, your name is your name, the information on that ID is accurate and correct. Right? Most people. Unfortunately, that's not true for trans folks. There's a lot of misconception out there at the corporate level and at the school level about when you can change a trans person's name on identification on records. There's really not a requirement, a legal requirement that there's a legal name change first to update databases. But different companies and different schools have private internal policies about when trans people can update their information. The same is true for birth certificates. A lot of schools won't change gender markers unless there's an updated birth certificate. And up until this past year, that was impossible to do in Ohio. So Ohio actually went to court on this, and then that was found unconstitutional. Because there was no remedy for trans people to update their birth certificates. There was just no way to do it. And right now, there's only one state where that's true. It's Tennessee. There's another that's passing a bill that's trying to restrict trans people and only trans people from updating their birth certificates. That's Oklahoma. In Ohio, I worry. I'm awake at night worrying about what this legislation may do to Ohio if we introduce a birth certificate bill, because it's unconstitutional, and we've already been to court on that. But that doesn't mean that lawmakers won't introduce it, especially now because there's a rise in anti-trans legislation. But it's important for trans people to have accurate IDs, just the same as it's important for cis people to have accurate IDs. But it's more important for trans folks because, registering for school, you need a birth certificate. Doing employment docs, you need accurate identification, you need ID, you need a passport or a birth certificate to prove who you are, just for your I-9 documentation, your W-2s, and you need your right to identification if something happens in an accident, or if something happens and you end up going to jail. If you have a name that doesn't reflect who you are, they may not identify the right people to come get you. They may not be able to reach out to your family. If you have the wrong sex listed on there, you may be housed in the incorrect facility, and really open yourself up to harm, to real dangers, to harassment, to sexual assaults. And these are things that happen a lot more often in the trans community when their IDs aren't updated to reflect their current presentations. And that's not a thought that a lot of cis people have. It's true even for accessing government benefits and homeless shelters. If the ID doesn't match the presentation, people are often turned away. Even though that's a violation of HUD rules, it still happens, and it happens frequently. All right. Now, this is not to make you feel bad. This is just to make you think. Here's a short list of cisgender privileges. And what I mean by that is, as a cis, not trans person, um, your gender has not impacted your life in a way that being transgender would have impacted your life. So as a cis person, it's fairly often that you're able to use public bathrooms without the fear of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, or arrest for being in the wrong place. And I want to tell a personal story here. Long before, in a land far, far away, before I was James, I lived another life, and it's funny to think back on this now because I was always a very masculine presenting person, but when I still was trying to present as female. I was still trying to live that life and be a woman. This was fairly early in my life. I was right around high school, and I went to a restaurant with my friends downtown, and I went into the women's restroom because I was a woman, and there was a woman in there who screamed at me. And it's interesting to think about now and in retrospect, because this was an adult, and I at the time was 17 or 18. But I was a kid wearing jeans, a hoodie, and a hat. Real short hair. I had more then, but just a kid. So she screamed at me, "There's a boy in here!" and then threw her shoe. So I got scared and left, and I went back to the table and got my friends and had my friend Mary come to the bathroom with me because it weirded me out. So she came in there with me, and that woman was still in there, and she threw a fit, left and got management. Then they came and kicked me out. And when I say they kicked me out, I mean a huge guy who probably was not all that tall, to be honest, because I was 5'6" in high school, and I'm 5'7" now. But he looked really tall, really, really big and scary. He drugged me out by the scruff of my neck, and they had police waiting. I was thrown over the hood of a police car. I had handcuffs put on me. I was read my rights, and I was getting arrested for loitering, also indecent exposure, and I forget the other one, but basically just being in the women's bathroom. And I was like screaming, like, "Check my pocket, check my pocket, check my pocket," because I was trying to get them to get my ID where it said my name and it said female next to sex. And at that point, my friend Mary had run away. My friend Alex was with us. He hightailed it out of there. They were scared. I don't know if they were going to get help or not. I'm going to presume good intentions, but they left me hanging. And I was in the back of that police car before I was able to communicate to a police officer who would listen to me to actually check my identification to see if I was a boy or a girl. And they did. They saw the F. They let me go. No apologies. I was banned from that restaurant. And I was in the right place that point. I was a woman presenting as a woman, just with short hair and a baseball cap, using the women's restroom as a 17 or 18-year-old kid. And this was back in 2002 now. But that stuff still happens today in 2022, 20 years later. As a cis person, you most often don't have to fear using public facilities like gym locker rooms or the changing facilities without being stared at, without being pointed at and laughed at, without being asked if you're in the right place. Strangers don't come up to you, like I was saying, and assume. They can ask what your genitals look like. They can ask if you've had the surgery. And when people ask me if I've had the surgery, I always say, yes, I had my tonsils out when I was 8, because that's true. And I've had a number of surgeries. I don't know what surgery they're asking about. It's very rude to just go up to someone and ask what medical procedures they've had done. Uh, and I think that's true regardless of medical condition. As cis people, your validity as a man or a woman or just a person in general isn't based on how well you pass as that gender. It doesn't matter how many surgeries you've had or if you're on medication. Your validity as a man or a woman is just based on you saying you're a man or a woman. If women have hysterectomies, no one questions whether or not they're still women. But if trans men have hysterectomies, it's a big deal, and people ask, have you had that surgery? You're not a man until you've had that surgery. That's not true. As cis people generally, you have the ability to walk through the world and blend in with everybody else. People aren't staring at you, gawking at you, pointing, whispering, laughing. People aren't asking if you're a man or a woman or in the right place. You generally can move through the world without worrying about your gender identity or expression. As cis people, your gender, male or female, is not considered a mental illness or a disorder. You don't have to go to a therapist to confirm that you are the gender you say you are. No one has to write a letter on your behalf. Strangers and friends and family call you by the name that you provide, even if it's not your legal name, without people asking if it's your real name. And if you answer, oh no, actually my legal name is Susan, but I go by Susie, people don't assume that they can just call you Susan, even though everyone else calls you Susie. They don't assume that your real name is your legal name. They have the right to call you that. Your real name is whatever you say it is. It's your name. It's very personal. People don't assume that they can misgender you based on your name. And there are a lot of names that were traditionally masculine that are now feminine. Ashley, Morgan, Megan, these were all male names, and now they're female names. Same with Leslie. People don't hear that name and automatically call Leslie's he, just because traditionally it was a masculine name. As cis people, you can reasonably assume that your ability to get hired at a job, to get promoted, to rent an apartment, to buy a house, secure a loan, it isn't based on your gender expression. You can reasonably assume that if you were denied those things, it's because of a good reason and not based on discrimination. For trans people, we may never know why we don't get that loan, why we didn't get that job. As cis people, generally, you have the ability to flirt with people, to form relationships, to start friendships with people without the fear that your gender identity will cause rejection or worse, a violent attack. And in emotional and sexual relationships, it's not going to make your partner question their own sexual orientation based on your gender. And this is true most often in the trans femme community. A lot of trans females, when they start dating cis men have like emotional breakdowns over it almost, and they start questioning, oh my gosh, I must be gay because I'm into this woman, and I gotta tell you that's not true, because if you're into trans women, you're into trans women. That doesn't change your sexual orientation. And I wish that in 2022 we could talk more openly about that, because it really causes not just stigma in the community but real violence. And if you look at TDOR, which is the Trans Day of Remembrance, it's a commemoration of all the trans people who lost their lives that year, just to transphobic violence. And the majority of that list is trans women, majority killed by lovers or people who were trying to date them, who found out their gender identity and rejected them, and ended that in violence. It's a huge number. I don't want to depress y'all, but I want everyone to be aware that that's a very real concern for trans people when they start dating, or when they go out and try to find friends. There's a very real fear of rejection. Um, Again, as cis people, when you end up in the hospital, in the emergency room, when something horrible happens to you, you don't have to worry that your gender is going to keep you from receiving the appropriate care. From receiving the right dosage of pain medicine, from receiving care at all. And we're going to assume that your medical issues are going to be treated individually and not seen as a result of your gender. And I know I brought up the trans broken arm syndrome last time, but we didn't really get a chance to talk about this. Trans broken arm syndrome it's really when providers assume that whatever the medical issue is, it's caused by someone's transness. And I gave the example, which is where trans broken arm syndrome comes from, that there was a trans man who was in a bike accident and broke his arm, and the emergency personnel who came to get him wrote in his charts that he had brittle bones due to testosterone usage because he was a trans man. That's absurd. That's not true. And, a lot of medical providers, a surprisingly high number of medical providers in 2022, incorrectly assume that medical conditions or concerns of trans people are caused by their transition. So it's caused by their hormone replacement therapy. It's caused by depression because they're transgender. It's caused just because they're trans, and that's really not true. One good example is up until very recently, any person who was starting on hormone replacement therapy, so HRT, either cross-sex estrogen or testosterone, they had to be tested regularly every 6 months for STDs on the presumption that trans people are high risk factors for HIV and AIDS just because they're trans. And while it's true that the instances of HIV infection is higher amongst the trans community, it's not because they're trans. It so how offensive is that when you're going into your regular doctor appointments to get a prescription refill and you have to prove that you have to submit to a full STD panel that isn't covered by your insurance. And I don't know if you've ever had an STD panel that wasn't at Planned Parenthood or that wasn't covered by insurance, but it's very expensive. And that's true regardless of a person's sexual history. So even if they weren't currently sexually active, even if they hadn't been sexually active in years, they still had to take those tests and prove that they didn't have HIV and other STDs before they could get refills on their prescriptions. Okay, and this largely isn't true anymore because the standards of care have been updated, but this is still happening in some hospitals, depending on where you at in different states. A lot of medical providers assume that a trans patient's transition is the cause of their, like, even if it's not the cause of the visit, even if they're for something totally different, they spend the majority of the time talking about their trans history or their gender history. So I know I gave the example last time of how I was refused care a couple of times. I was turned away when I had pneumonia because the doctor there said that it wasn't his specialty. That was interesting. But even folks who go in for colds and for sinus infections, sometimes they spend the majority of their doctor visit talking about their gender history, their surgery histories, and how long they've been trans. And it has nothing to do with sinus infections. It has nothing to do with the visit. And that's not true for cis people. So that's part of trans broken arm syndrome, where providers don't see patients as patients; they just see them as trans. And this is true for a number of reasons. I don't want to assume it's personal bias against trans patients because that may not be the case. There's education lacking there. In medical textbooks, trans people aren't even a full page. I still do a number of panels for hospitals and different doctors' offices, just like this, doing trans 101s and sharing stories. But a lot of providers, even here in Ohio, will assume that they can't see trans people because they're not an expert in gender care. And to treat a trans person as a mental health or physical health provider, you don't have to understand everything about transgenderism. You don't have to be an expert in trans care. You just need to see trans people as regular people and treat them as whole human beings, which is how the standards of care are evolving here. It's really hard still in 2022 to navigate medical spaces while trans. You know, for a number of reasons. Folks have concerns about being denied care, about having to jump through hoops that cis people don't have to go through, extra pre-authorizations, extra letters, extra specialty appointments just to get basic care. Or people are concerned about being treated poorly once they do actually find a healthcare provider. And, under the Affordable Care Act, uh, anyone should be able to get sex-specific services regardless of their gender. All trans care is supposed to be covered under insurance provided by the marketplace, but there's still insurance companies that deny care at just as standard practice based on different medical codes. So people still have to fight, and they still have to file those claims of denials, and largely folks are winning, but the problem here is cis folks don't have to file all those different paperwork. This is time consuming, it's confusing, and it's just an extra burden that trans people face. And folks worry about their providers being uneducated or unfriendly, and worse, even if the provider is really trans competent and really affirming and the best doctor for that person, that may not be true for the office staff. It may not be true for the STNAs or for the nurses, for the receptionists, for the janitors walking the hallways, and it certainly may not be true for people waiting in the waiting room. There are some things trans folks have to really be conscious about that cis people don't have to think about so often. So disclosure of their gender identity. If a form asks for sex, that's a real question for trans people. Do they put sex assigned at birth? Do they put legal sex? If they put legal sex and not sex assigned at birth, is the doctor going to refuse to see them? Is the doctor going to misdiagnose them? If they put their sex assigned at birth and it's different from their legal sex and the sex on their insurance, is that visit going to be covered? Is it okay to talk to medical providers about your support systems or your lack of support systems? As cis people, you're generally able to talk about your life with your therapists and your doctors, what's really affecting you and how you're feeling anxious and depressed. As trans people, if you're too open about being depressed, you may find yourself on a 72-hour watch list. You may be misdiagnosed as suicidal when you're not, and doctors may not take what you're saying seriously, or doctors may think that may react hyperbolically, and may assume that you're depressed only because you're trans. Trans broken arm syndrome again. And a big consideration for every trans person is when and how to educate providers, because even trans youth at some point in their lives, they have to educate a provider, whether it's a dentist, a therapist, a doctor, a specialist, or just a family care physician. These are conversations that are educational for the providers, but it's burdensome to trans folks. Because they have to not just educate providers on their body and how they relate to their gender identity, but often all trans 101. They're asked questions that maybe they're not prepared to answer, maybe they don't know the answer to, and they feel like they are required to know everything about being trans before they can talk to doctors, because what if doctors ask, and if they don't know the answers, they're not really trans. And that's not true. As we remember from last time, the way we think about gender is very individualized and difficult. It's hard to explain what being male means, even to me. It's hard to explain what being female means. So asking trans people to have a concrete definition before they can start seeking care is just really unrealistic and burdensome. But I think that the real takeaway here is a large number of trans people have many doctors because they don't feel safe with any one doctor. A large number of trans people use clinics because they don't have a doctor who they feel that they can trust. A large number of trans Americans here don't have any health care whatsoever, even though the Affordable Care Act has been passed, and even though insurance is cheaper than ever. A large number of trans people can't afford health care, or they don't want to get health care because even the healthcare plans that are good may not be good for them and may not cover what they need covered. The majority of trans people here living in America feel that they can't be honest with their primary care physician. And that, friends, is a real problem. Does anyone have questions about that? I know, it's rough. Navigating gender segregated spaces while trans is another difficult life experience. It's combating negative stereotypes and fear of what trans people are. And this is on the rise, especially as Alabama just passed a trans bathroom bill for the first time since 2016. A bathroom bill's been introduced. But when we talk about trans people, the majority of Americans still picture a Jerry Springer kind of image. So a really tall, really bulky man in a dress and a wig, and that's not what trans people are. That's not a fair portrayal, and it wasn't back then. It certainly isn't now that we know better. But there's a real stigma out there, and there's been fear placed in the communities that trans people who use bathrooms are sexual predators, and that's not based in any reality whatsoever. The number of assaults in bathrooms are 99.9% on transgender people from cisgender people. Trans people are not going into restrooms and committing nefarious actions. They're going into the bathrooms to use the facilities. And more often than not, trans people will choose to navigate to safe bathrooms. So if they don't know a space, they'll purposely not use the bathroom there. And this is especially true for trans students in schools right now. If they feel that using bathrooms in between classes or at lunch is going to be embarrassing, or is going to out them, or is going to cause anxiety, these kids are choosing not to eat and not to drink, which over years really leads to kidney issues and eating disorders down the line. And using bathrooms in high schools, it's kind of embarrassing for everyone, whether you're cis or trans, but it's extra rough for trans people, especially when more and more schools are talking about existing policies that allow trans students to use the restrooms in accordance to their gender identity and reversing them. So now trans kids who have had no issues using bathrooms are now suddenly scared to use bathrooms because what if they get expelled for using the bathroom that they should be using? You wouldn't want me in the women's room, you know. You certainly wouldn't. Now I wouldn't blame someone for coming in and dragging me off in handcuffs if I was in the ladies' room. That's a different circumstance here. But family bathrooms and disabled stalls. A lot of cis folks will assume that is a solution to trans people using restrooms, that they should use a separate facility, like a family restroom, or if there's a disabled restroom, to use that one, if there's a nurse's restroom, to use that. But that's really not a solution for at least two reasons. The first is those family restrooms are for families. You would be kind of upset, I think, if you were a mother holding an infant, waiting in line with a toddler, and I came out of the bathroom. That was the family restroom. That's not a space for me. Same is true for using disabled stalls. If you needed a handicapped accessible area, you'd be pretty mad at waiting in line and I came walking out. That's not a space for me. The same is true for nurses stations in elementary schools and high schools. Those are for sick kids, but it also comes with the addition of outing that kid as trans. If trans kids can only use the nurses room, kids who are using the nurses room often, they're going to be presumed as trans, whether or not they are. And there's been a number of lawsuits and cases that we have legal precedent here that there's no problem with trans people using restrooms in accordance to their gender identity. And I want to point out that there's society really, really no problem with using restrooms. Most trans people have used restrooms with a lot of issues, which is really upsetting because the majority of cisgender people have used the restroom next to a trans person and didn't even know. Their life was forever unchanged, because if you're the one peeking under the stall, trying to look through the cracks in the door, I'm going to be honest with you, you're probably the pervert in that situation. You're the one who's doing something wrong. But sex segregated bathrooms are kind of a new idea, actually, and it's not the way we talk about it. We talk about traditionally bathrooms were always either male or female, and trans people didn't exist. But that's not true. Trans people use the bathrooms that they felt most comfortable in with no problem for the majority of recorded human history. The first gender segregated public bathroom was in 1739, and it was temporary. It was a pop up at a fancy ball, and it was all the rage because there were separate chamber pots in separate rooms for the men and the women. And it was kind of extraordinary at the time, and people didn't pick up on it for a long, long time because it was kind of richy. The common folks thought that was kind of absurd. You don't need separate spaces. Everyone used the same pot. And in the U.S., we didn't have any laws about gender segregated restrooms until 1887. And I want to point out that it was in relation to the workplace. So in 1887 in factories, if there were women around, they had to have gender segregated bathrooms for women. And that became more and more the common theme of things after like 1920. But that first state was Massachusetts, and it literally in the statute says if the workplace employs women, there has to be a restroom for women. And in the majority of the state at that time, the bathroom just became a unisex bathroom, a gender neutral bathroom. And it wasn't until a little bit later that they started building separate restroom facilities for men and women. But after the 1920s, that became the norm for everywhere that wasn't an individual home, which of course is still gender neutral. And in 2013, so not that long ago, we had the first landmark case in trans rights where the Colorado Civil Rights Division said that trans students specifically can use restrooms in accordance to their gender identity. At the time, they didn't have any specific laws on record, and that kind of bled out into regular society, which was great because a lot of people think that there's a law out there that says only cis men can use men's room and only cis women can use women's room, and that's never been the law anywhere. Years later, after 2013, the U.S. DOJ and the Department of Education released a joint statement that said, trans people, based not just on the Colorado case, but federal law under Title IX, trans people have a right to use the bathrooms in accordance with their gender identity, even if it's not the sex assigned at birth. And that's been, cemented as the law since 2016 under guidance. And I want to point out Title IX hasn't changed. The verbiage of Title IX still says based on sex. But in 2016, federal guidance was updated to include that because of sex or based on sex, inherently includes sex assigned at birth and gender identity, because you cannot talk about gender identity without talking about sex. Um, and there weren't really any issues until later on that year, and I really want to point out the timeline here, because early 2016 the federal government came out with this joint statement, and then later that year in 2016 HB2, so the infamous North Carolina bathroom bill, was introduced and passed by a majority. That bill was immediately challenged. It was stayed by the courts, and a number of businesses pulled out of the states. Concerts didn't happen. Contracts weren't signed, and that's really why bathroom bills in other states started failing. Because in 2016 and 2017, there was a flood of bathroom bills introduced across the nation. I listed here in the slide a couple of those states. I want to point out that those bills stopped being introduced in 2017, and just this year, yesterday, Alabama introduced a bathroom bill that says that trans students have to use the bathrooms that correspond to their sex assigned at birth. That's a violation of Title IX, of against federal law. And also, it's kind of really just offensive that there have been no documented cases, no complaints at all about trans people using bathrooms and causing any kind of harm. But that's not the story we're hearing from legislators in different states, like Alabama. There were no complaints of trans students causing any harm in bathrooms. But just yesterday, they passed this bill. I do want to point out, though, real quick, before we break, that even though it's not looking great in the trans rights movement, due to this onslaught of anti-trans legislation introduced, trans people and non-binary people still have rights. We have rights in education, in employment, in healthcare, in insurance, in privacy, travel, and public spaces at the federal level. We still have those rights. We also have a right to proper identification, which now includes Ohio birth certificates and federal passports. And this is a huge deal because starting next week on Monday, trans folks can get non-binary passports, so an X passport. So if folks don't identify as male or female, they can get an X on their passport. So we'll join the 8 other countries that have non-binary passports. And this is going to impact not just trans and intersex people, but a number of cis people also are interested in X passports. It's going to be complicated the next couple of months after this change has happened, because TSA is going to have to update all of their databases and how they interact with all passengers coming through. They're changing the body scanners and how they're able to security and pat downs for folks based on passports. And it's going to be interesting to see how this affects people with X passports entering other countries, because some countries recognize the X and others don't. And some of the countries that don't will still accept passports from other countries, but some that don't will require their passports to look like that country's passport. So they have to have either male or female before they're able to enter the country. And is that a violation of international treaties? Is that a violation of individual rights? Maybe. We don't know yet. We haven't seen. No one's challenged it yet because we haven't been able to. I did see the comment about sexual predators will not dress up as trans people to go into bathrooms. They'll just go into bathrooms, which is true. I don't know where this Bugs Bunny style comedy has come from, where people are saying that they're not transphobic. They support trans people, but they can't have trans inclusive bathrooms because cisgender men will dress up as women to go into bathrooms to harass women because trans women are allowed in there. The logic behind that is just missing.
They're also going to dress up as women so they can play sports and win.
Right.
I know. I can't.
Oh man, I know, it's absurd. The idea that a boy would want to win so bad that he would pretend to be a girl for 2 years to be able to compete, and then compete in that sport, win, and then say, no, I was a boy all along. Haha, got you, but I'm still a winner, is like, it's not even science fiction. It's not even fantasy. It's just absurdity. That's unimaginable. But that's the narrative that a lot of people who are pro these sports bills will paint. It's that boys who are losing will choose to transition for the purpose of winning titles and stealing scholarships, and that's absurd.
James, we did just have two different questions, and we talked about this briefly at the very beginning. They're asking about how the Don't Say Gay bill or House Bill 616 is going to affect trans people and the implications that those could have.
We're gonna talk about that a little later today, actually. So those are good questions. We'll talk about all the legislation at the end.
And we have another one from Annie. Annie says, I have a question about the X identifier. What are the benefits of getting it? I can see as a binary trans person, it would be helpful to have documentation and alignment with your gender. But in a world in which many people don't know about or don't believe or agree with the existence of non-binary identities, wouldn't being out as non-binary invite a lot of discrimination?
That's a good question, and it really depends on where people live. A lot of folks who identify as non-binary, especially in states where they can have non-binary birth certificates and state IDs like California, getting a non-binary passport has the effect of aligning all of their documentation to be the same. And that's very validating. And it also has the additional bonus of being in alignment with the Real ID Act, where all your identification is supposed to be uniform. And the majority of trans people, that's not the case because they have mismatched identification. But it's true that having an X, and some states have an O, but the federal passport's going to be X. They open themselves, I don't want to say open themselves up, but they do experience increased discrimination and increased scrutiny and questioning when accessing, just federal travel, buses and, trains, planes, and just, federal documentation and employment documentation too. My partner actually lives in California, or in Canada, and they have an X passport. They've been able to have an X passport for about 4 years now. And I'll tell you that the only time they ever get harassed when traveling is coming to the US. And it's a really real possibility that that harassment will stop once TSA is trained and once we have those same X passports. Because right now we haven't been accepting X passports. We've been turning away people with X passports from some countries and letting them in with X passports from other countries. It hasn't been uniform, and it's based on poor training and no real laws behind that. So it's good that we're catching up with the rest of the world in having X passports. I think that we'll see more and more countries coming on board with X passports. I would honestly prefer if we took gender off passports altogether, because we have a photo ID on that. We have your name and other identifying purpose or other identification on there. I don't think gender is really necessary on travel documents like that, especially because it doesn't really identify you better than a picture would. But who knows? I don't know what's going to happen with discrimination in X passports. I really foresee, unfortunately, when these anti-trans bills die down, that legislators will come after non-binary people specifically. And that's a very real fear that the non-binary community has. That's a good question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to it. working with the trans community and working within the trans community, I want to be pretty transparent here that when you're working with the trans community, you're also going to be working with a very diverse population. Trans people come from all backgrounds, all races, all religions, all cultures, really. So when we're talking about the trans community, we need to start addressing the isms that exist in those communities. And the very first is racism. And that's really important, especially as white people, to acknowledge, myself as a white man, that, you know, when we talk about the trans community and the statistics against the trans community, life expectancies, rates of harm, rates of violence, they're always higher for trans women, and they're always higher for trans people of color. So Black trans women specifically are the most targeted out of the entire trans community. And that's based because of racism and because of misogyny. So trans women, unfortunately, have the triple threat of having to deal with racism, misogyny, and transphobia. So it's exponentially harder for people who are coming from minority backgrounds to also be transgender. And we need to realize that and really recognize it when we're talking about the trans community and, rights within the trans community. Because when we talk about equal rights, we're not just talking about binary and white trans people. We're talking about the whole community, everyone. So we have to really acknowledge the disparities even within the trans community and the obstacles that exist, especially for people of color. A good example is when we're talking about trans people of Latin descent. Latinx was forced, was a word forced on that community, even though they prefer the term Latine. So I'm going to type it in. Well, it's Latine. So there's no X, it's an E, and that goes in line with how the Spanish language is spoken. And the community members were very clear about that, but media took over, and Latinx became like a trend, and it almost became like a dog whistle. And people assumed that if you didn't say Latinx, that you were transphobic and you weren't including trans people of Latin descent, and that's not true. The word is Latine. And we really, as people, need to assume the best intentions when people do things like that. We want to assume that people are trying to help. We want to assume that people are coming from a good place and with visibility. Often we need to remember that we need to allow trans people to lead in visibility, and that the stories we tell are the stories that trans people want told and aren't coming from a very cis-focused background. So that really starts with doing your own homework. The word dead name is a word that has come up in popular culture pretty frequently now. It's in shows and it's in books, and it comes from this idea that when trans people were violently killed because they were transgender, the news articles would misprint their names. So trans people weren't even getting the respect of having the correct names in death, and that was referred to as dead naming someone. So dead naming as a verb is a really violent act, and it's disrespecting a trans person in death. The word has kind of changed over time, and now it's a noun, and a lot of people use the term dead name to mean their previous legal name or their birth name. I'm hearing a lot more cis people using the word dead name casually in conversation to mean somebody's previous legal name. And I want to point out that the historical evolution of dead name is really personal to a lot of trans people who have lost friends and family members to violence. So as cis people, please don't use the word dead name to mean somebody's previous name or to mean birth name. If you use the term, people will assume that you are at least familiar with the trans community. But if you're using the word around trans people, they may not necessarily. They may think that you're less friendly than you may necessarily are, just based on using the word. So do your own homework when it comes to interacting with trans folks, and that includes reaching out to trans-led organizations, groups, choosing trans programs over cis-run programs when they involve the trans community, and having intentional conversations with trans people about the things that affect them. And when I say intentional, I mean don't bombard your one trans friend with questions on Facebook. Set aside a real time and let them know that you value their experience, and you want to have a long conversation, maybe over lunch, opposed to just back and forth on Facebook Messenger. But really, I want folks to realize that there's no one way to be trans, and there's no trans experience. I know in the first session we kind of discussed that there is a popular narrative that all trans people knew that they were trans at 3 years old, and that's just not everyone's experience. So it's kind of damaging when popular society chooses one dominant narrative to run with when we're talking about trans people, because it's just othering to trans folks who don't have that experience. And gender is very confusing for a lot of folks, even when they're not trans. So to tell trans people that they aren't really trans because they didn't know when they were a child is just it's uneducated. It's not based in any kind of fact or science. But recognize that there are lots of different ways to be trans, but the majority of discrimination and disparities coming at the trans community is felt by the whole trans community, even if people are in places of more privilege than their other trans brothers and sisters and siblings. So it's always good to be a visible ally. Uh, in all spaces, I think it's best practice to always assume that there's a trans person in the room, even if you're unsure. And what I mean by being a visible ally is, don't go to LGBT support groups and announce that the A stands for ally and that's why you're there. I want you to be a visible ally by calling representatives on anti-trans bills, on LGBT forward bills, but calling to vote yes. When you hear transphobic language as an ally, you can shut that down. And we cannot overemphasize the power of a cis straight white man saying, "Hey, that's not cool," when somebody says something transphobic. Because a lot of times minority community members speaking up, if they say, you can't talk that way about trans people, they're presumed to be transgender, and then they start getting discrimination too. But if you are in a position of privilege, I encourage you to use it in the ways you can, and having real conversations with coworkers, with family, with friends, that trans people are just like cis people, really, and we deserve the same kind of rights, privileges, and protections as everybody else. But most importantly, y'all, language is evolving, and it has evolved as long as I've been in the trans community, and it will continue to evolve long after I've moved on. The way we talk about language and the way we experience the world around us, the way we talk about the way we experience gender expression, it's been changing. The language we have to address the trans community has changed. The things we say in the 90s aren't things we say anymore. And that's true not just with words like transgenderist, which no longer exists, or it's non-binary. There are more and more categories under the non-binary umbrella now than I can name off the top of my head. And it's because the youth are coming up with new ways to describe themselves and new ways to talk about their experiences. And with that comes new language. And that's why it's so important to have spaces for trans people to get together and have conversations. Because for decades and decades, the common experience for trans people is to believe that they were the only one. They're the only one that felt that way. They're the only trans person they knew for a number of years before they were able to meet somebody else. And before we had the internet, people were able to meet through personal ads. We had different magazines, the Transgender Tapestry, which is no longer in print. That was a trans-focused magazine just for trans people. And it's because there wasn't, an acceptable place to meet in public. And now, kids have Discord and the internet. They have, media that's made just for them. And that's wonderful, because now we have new ways of communicating and new ways of telling trans youth specifically that they're not alone and there's nothing wrong with them. Because especially coming from more of a Midwest or rural area, that may not be their experience. So it's really good that we're able to allow language to evolve. But I really want to stress that as language evolves, just keep up with it. We don't say GLBT anymore, we say LGBT. And as language evolves, people will continue to push back against it, but it's going to move on without you, if whether you get on board or not. So just try to keep up with common terminology and continue going to these kinds of educational programs. That way that you're up to date. All right, now we can talk about trans legislation. So just this year in 2022, there have been over 200 anti-trans bills specifically introduced across the U.S. We are at an unprecedented time in United States history and world history, even, where there's like a legislative assault on trans people. And I want to be clear here that these bills are purposefully taking away and restricting rights that currently exist. All right, so we have here in Ohio has been introduced a bill restricting medical care for trans youth, a bill restricting and limiting education for a number of folks, but specifically based on LGBT education, bills limiting participating in sports, and in Alabama, bills restricting access to bathrooms. President Biden, when he first took office, issued new guidance on protecting trans students, but he didn't issue an executive order at that time. Since then, he's issued new guidance and more additional executive orders that kind of mirrored President Obama's executive orders, basically directing the federal departments to do their jobs to protect trans students from discrimination in the Department of Education, to protect trans people from violence in the Department of Justice, and directing states to abide by Title IX, by Title VII, and the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. But we still have, I think, 9 states now that have introduced anti-trans bills. The majority of these bills have been, or the laws rather, have been stayed by courts, the federal courts challenging whether or not they're constitutional, but that hasn't stopped other states from introducing similar bills. So here in Ohio, what bill we want to talk about first? 616. Yeah, let's talk 616. That's the Don't Say Gay bill. 616 really is the worst parts of the anti-critical race theory and anti-honesty in education bills, 327 and 321, meshed with Ohio's Don't Say Gay or Don't Say Trans bill. What it does is it prevents educators from teaching divisive concepts. And the bill specifically lists out a number of categories that it decides are divisive, but it also is very broad and intentionally vague. So anything that's considered divisive could be unlawful to teach, kindergarten through 12th grade. And that's really concerning to the LGBT community, because just being a trans or queer person, just acknowledging that trans people exist, could be considered divisive, depending on the locality. And what's worse about that bill is it later goes on to explicitly ban instruction or discussion of sexual orientation and gender identity through kindergarten through third grade. And I want to point out real quick that every single person has a gender identity, whether it's cisgender, transgender, or something else. So to limit discussion or education of gender identity would mean we can't talk about human relationships. So if we were to pass this bill and to apply it equally across the board, we couldn't ask students to talk about their families, because mentioning mommy and daddy is enforcing a cisgender and heterosexual lifestyle. So we can't talk about sexual orientation and mention marriages, because that implies a sexual orientation. We can't talk about brothers and sisters without mentioning gender identity, because those words are gendered. We can't talk about our neighbors, the people who are important to us, even historical figures, without mentioning gender identity and sexual orientation often. So it really is very limiting under third grade. But fourth through 12th grade, kids are allowed to learn about gender identity and sexual orientation in a developmentally appropriate way, and in accordance to state standards. The problem with that is there are no state standards about what is developmentally appropriate when talking about sexual orientation and gender identity in those grades. I really want to point out that in kindergarten, when we talk about sexual education, what we're talking about is, where's the no touch zones? We're trying to prevent, inappropriate touching. There's not learning about graphic, sex, and there's a real misconception about sexual education in the U.S. When we talk about sex ed, but I really want to point out that that's what we mean when we talk about sex ed in kindergarten. So to prohibit sex ed in kindergarten means we can't talk about, preventing assaults and preventing, sexual assaults. That fourth through 12th grade, who's to say what is developmentally appropriate? Who's to say what is what it is? Is that determined by the individual class? Is it determined by the individuals in the class? What if we have fourth graders who, the teacher thinks are more mature than the average fourth graders? Is that okay to teach about sexual orientation and gender identity? Just that fourth grade, not other fourth grades? Is it determined by the school board? Is it determined by the state? Because it's not in the bill. And the Department of Education, in Ohio has no no policies on what when to start talking about gender identity and sexual orientation. Because again, we all have gender identity and a sexual orientation. So what is developmentally appropriate? We don't know. And the lawmakers who wrote this bill, or who rather introduced this bill, they don't know either. And, I think that is significant, that this bill was introduced the week of early voting in Ohio. It was introduced by two first-term lawmakers who are seeking re-election. And there's no good in this bill at all. The Ohio Teachers Association actually came out against this. The whole bill, I encourage you to read it. It'll make you mad, because it really is limiting free speech. It's limiting education, and it puts not just our students but our educators at risk of open discrimination and censorship in a place that should be educational and should be a space for growing and learning. The very worst part about the bill, aside from the obvious racism and the obvious anti-LGBT bias, is it opens a private cause of action for anyone who feels that a divisive concept has been taught. Not that a divisive concept has been taught, nothing that says it was objectively divisive, but that a parent feels a divisive concept was taught. They're able to sue the individual teacher, the principal of that school, and the school board. And the problem with that, aside from a flood of unnecessary lawsuits and unfounded lawsuits, is going to be that schools are going to lose a lot of money defending those claims, because if this bill were to pass and become law, if a teacher was to be found teaching a divisive concept, divisive, defined by whomever, that would be a violation of law. So their malpractice insurance wouldn't pay for that. So if there was a lawsuit against the school board, everyone's in trouble. So who ends up paying that? Ooh, the worst part. Oh man, if that happens, schools also lose funding. So in addition to having to pay out of the school's budget to defend these lawsuits, the students are going to lose funding. That's funding to books and educational equipment, but also to structural equipment and to upgrades to the school. So everybody loses. It's not just the trans kids. It's not just the LGBT kids. It's not just the kids of color. It's not just disabled kids. Because when we talk about divisive concepts here, that's really wide and really, really intentionally vague. And everyone in that classroom is going to be at a worse position, because they're not going to be able to talk about history openly, and they're not going to be able to talk about current events either. It really is going to impact the entire education system. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but as someone who has relatives in the teaching industry, really, my grandfather was a principal. Both of my sisters are teachers, both elementary school. This bill is horrendous, and it's unconstitutional. It's unfair, and it's really absurd. The problem with it is the legislators who vote on these bills often don't read them, so they don't even know what's in here, which is why I, as an attorney and as an advocate, always recommend people call their representatives and speak their minds about this, because these bills are, purposely misleading in their titles. So people see, the Save Women's Sports Act, for example, and they think, oh, I want to protect women, and they sign off on it. And they don't realize that the Save Women's Sports Act doesn't save women, doesn't protect sports. It specifically prohibits trans students from participating in school sports, which again is a violation of Title IX. But what's worse about the Save Women's Sports Act is, anyone who is accused of being trans, they have the burden of proof to prove that they're not. So a woman or a girl on a team who may be too tall, maybe too muscular, maybe too fast, by somebody else's standards, is accused of being trans and having a biological advantage. She has to prove that she is cisgender. And how does she prove that? By karyotyping, so by taking pictures of chromosomes through a medical procedure, which is expensive and invasive and not covered by insurance, or by a genital exam. And in the bill, it actually says, external and internal examination of genitalia. I don't know about you, but I am really offended by that, because this covers kindergarten all the way through college. I don't want anybody's genitals being examined during a sports physical, or being brought into question by a school before a student can participate in school sports. That is not just a really dangerous affront to privacy. It's just offensive, honestly, because that's not something that we want our kids to go through. You shouldn't have to get a pap smear to play volleyball. That's just not appropriate. And I think the most offensive thing about the Save Women's Sports Act is it's written by cis people who did not take any considerations of trans student athletes, into thought here. In Ohio specifically, trans students have been able to participate under the Ohio High School Athletic Association policy since 2014 with no problems whatsoever. So to suddenly pass a bill to restrict participation, not just competition, but participation is a real affront to student rights, because really anyone who is accused of being trans is in danger of losing their spot on the team, or having to go through really invasive and personal medical procedures to prove that they belong there. And that's just really not a good direction to go in. In other states, the Save Women's Sports Act has been held unconstitutional, but it's introduced in more and more. And I want to talk about Leah Thomas too, since we have a moment. Leah Thomas is a transgender swimmer on the Pennsylvania team, and she's been the focus of a lot of media attention recently. She's a 22-year-old college student. She's been swimming for a number of years. Before transitioning, she participated on the men's team and was very good. She wasn't a top athlete when she was participating on the men's team, but her scores were very, very near the top. So she was about, I don't want to say rankings because I forget, but she was in no way failing as a male swimmer. But she didn't want to be on the men's team because she wasn't a man, and she's at that point in her life where it was obvious that her gender identity was female and she wanted to begin transitioning, so she did. And she began hormone replacement therapy, which under NCAA current regulations was 2 years of testosterone suppression. And after that time, she began swimming on the women's team. So she followed the rules and joined the team, tried out for the team, got on the team, and was doing kind of poorly for a while because when trans women begin transitioning, they lose a lot of muscle mass. And they gain a lot of fatigue. It's going through second puberty. It's going through a lot of growing pains. But it's very frustrating for a lot of trans women when they begin transitioning, because things that used to be super easy for them, like opening pickle jars, are suddenly hard. And it's kind of alarming. So Leah Thomas trained extra hard to regain her strength. She started doing better in races and started winning. At that point, she started getting media attention as a biological male who was stealing championship titles and winning races because she had a biological advantage. But if you look at her current times compared to her old times, she's still slower than she was before. And her improvement is in line with any athlete who's training at her level. There wasn't a drastic increase in ability. It's been slow and steady. She has not broken any world records. And I think it's really noteworthy here that no one was talking about her until she started winning. And that's true for the two runners out of I forget what state, but that's the case that really started all this attack on trans athletes. They were two black trans women runners who ended up winning a race, and there was a lawsuit filed against them by the parents of the third place girl, stating that because those two athletes were born male, that they had an inherent biological advantage, and that it wasn't fair that they competed, and that they stole scholarship opportunities and titles and recognitions from rightful winners. And it's really important to follow up on that case, because the third place girl, the cis girl, got a running scholarship, and she's running now. The two trans women didn't get scholarships. They didn't place. They're not professional runners anymore. They have been bullied out of the sports. And Leah, the 22-year-old swimmer, she's receiving hate mail from people across the nation. People who have never cared about women's swimming suddenly are experts. And, it's just really disconcerting to watch this happen, because she's followed the NCAA policies. Even when the NCAA changed their policies during her career. So now you have to be on testosterone repression drugs longer. So she still follow the rules, but there are governors in other states who have proclaimed her not the winner of the NCAA title, even though she won. And the NCAA just this year changed their rankings just for people who were competing against Leah, so that people who came in second tied with her. And generally, the sixth place person is the last person on the title. But this year, the seventh place person was also involved. So it's interesting the way people talk about fairness in sports and saying that it's not fair that trans people compete at all in sports. But when trans people are competing, they are stripped of their titles and they are forced to share share opportunities, to share the stage. They're not given scholarships, and they're bullied at every level, and that's considered fair. So it's just really telling where the trans misogyny comes from, because trans men have been competing in sports for a long time too, and there was a trans masculine swimmer in the Pennsylvania team too, and while he got some news, not much. No one's trying to pass laws preventing him from swimming, and it's because he's not competing at, or he's not winning. That's why. It's just really disheartening, especially to watch young trans kids right now trying to play sports and trying to find themselves, because kids play sports for the same reasons, whether they're cis or trans, and it's because they like it, because it's fun, and because they want to make friends. I played sports all through school. I wasn't necessarily good at all of them, but they were still really important to me. I played basketball for a long time, and I actually ended up having to lose my position because when everyone else got their growth spurts, I stayed 5'6", so I was no longer really able to play forward. I had to learn how to run real fast to stay on the team. But there's no reason why kids shouldn't be able to play sports, especially because they're protected under Title IX. All kids should have the same opportunities to try out for and participate in school sports and other activities. There's also, let me go back, I'm sorry. The medical ban was introduced. It's 545, and that prevents any trans or non-binary youth from accessing gender-affirming care if they're under 18. The problem with that is it only applies to trans people, not even intersex people. It's dubbed the Protect or the Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act to insinuate that hormone suppression drugs and hormone replacement therapy is experimentation, but it's not. Those same drugs are used for precocious puberty, and cis people can still get those drugs under this bill. But under this bill, trans kids specifically cannot access gender-affirming care, regardless of parental consent, regardless of current diagnoses, and regardless of current care plan. So if someone has already started a medical transition with hormone replacement therapy, if this bill passes, they have to stop. And hormones, y'all, plays a really big job in the body. It's not just secondary sex characteristics. It's not just growing beards. It's muscle definition. It deals with digestion and sleep. Hormones plays a really big part in your body, and when your hormones are thrown out of whack, that leads to not just mental distress but physical ailments, fatigue, headaches, and a lot of other pretty serious conditions that aren't being taken into consideration at all here. We would force trans kids to stop their course of treatments or to move to another state. And that is just absurd, especially because it's already hard to receive appropriate treatment as a trans kid. And I don't think that these lawmakers understand that before trans people can start on hormone replacement therapy, they have to get letters of recommendation. They have to have seen a therapist. Even under informed consent, which doesn't require letters, they have to have, presented as trans. They have to have documentation that it's been that they basically that they're competent and that they know their gender. They have to jump through hoops that cis people don't have to jump through. So there's already a burden of care there. So then to say that it's too easy for trans children to receive care is just offensive, because I really want to point out here that gender affirming care is really just care that takes into consideration a patient's gender and affirming it. So what does that mean? It means not fighting with your patient about what their gender is. It means just treating them as a human being. So it really starts with using the correct pronouns. When we talk about, that bill, a lot of people are saying that we need it because transgender children are having irreversible sex change surgeries without thoughts, and there's a damage. There's the risk for harm out there, because what if that trans kid isn't really trans and they've ruined their life because they've had this surgery? And I really want to point out that there are no trans children having irreversible sex change surgeries. Certainly not walking into a gender clinic and walking back out the way these lawmakers talk about it. It's part of a long care plan. If surgery is even desired. But the youngest person to receive gender affirming surgery has been 16, and they had to get parental consent, and they were receiving treatment for a long time before that happened. So I really think this conversation ties back into what is gender nonconforming, because these lawmakers are really just confusing the the uptick in gender nonconformity in youth with a need to protect them from turning trans, and that's not what's happening. The fact that more youth are able to express themselves in less gendered ways does not indicate that there are more transgender people than there used to be. What it indicates is two things. First, that trans people are more comfortable coming out and they have the language to do so. The second is that cis people are able to express their gender in ways that they haven't been able to before. That doesn't make them trans. It doesn't mean that they want sex changes. A large talking point is lesbians will get double mastectomies if we don't restrict these bills. Or if we don't pass these restrictive bills, which is absurd, because lesbians aren't by and large getting mastectomies just because they're gender nonconforming. And also, this bill doesn't do anything for cis people. So if a lesbian wanted to go get a double mastectomy or to get breast augmentation, she doesn't have to worry about this bill. She can still do that. But if it's a trans man who happens to be under 18, that's a different conversation, which really points out the point of this bill is to prevent trans children from beginning their transition in the hopes that there'll be less trans adults. And that's really what this is about. It's really about preventing trans people from transitioning at all. And it's not going to help because trans people have been around for all of recorded history. Trans people will continue to be here, regardless of how difficult society makes it for trans people. The only question is, how safe they're going to feel and how they're able to live full and happy, successful lives. And hopefully, these bills are just one blip, an unfortunate blip in human history. I hope that we will defeat them all, but it's we'll see what happens here in Ohio. I have firm belief that they won't go anywhere. It's unconstitutional, and we're going to spend a lot of money defending these lawsuits. So let's hope that we don't. I'm sorry. Let's hope that they don't pass. But let's talk real quick about ways for you to become a trans ally. There, is that better? This is pretty common sense after today, I hope, is use gender neutral language when you can. Always assume that there's a trans person in the room if you aren't sure. don't gossip about trans people to other people, because trans folks will overhear. And you shouldn't be saying things behind people's backs that you wouldn't say in front of their face. And also that really just creates a really negative work environment. And it's true for dealing with patients too. Don't talk about trans patients where people can hear you. Just don't gossip in general. It's always good practice to ask for pronouns in private and to use pronouns in public. And what I mean by that is, if you're in a group of people, if you put someone on the spot and ask them what their pronouns are, that could be really off-putting, and it could be a conversation they're not ready to have, especially with you if you're a stranger, and especially children. If we're talking to trans kids, they may feel really just put on the spot and like it's a trap. And if they use neopronouns or they them pronouns, they may not feel comfortable doing so, even though what you're doing is you're trying to be polite and you're trying to ask. So if you're curious about a person's pronoun, or you need to know, it's best to ask them in private, so not in front of other people, but always use them in public if someone is misgendering someone and using the wrong pronouns. I find the best way to correct that is just to very quickly insert the right pronoun so that they hear you, and not to make a big deal out of it, because people will react usually defensively when they feel like they're being accused of being transphobic, and that may not be the case. They may just have slipped up and used the wrong pronoun. So if someone's doing that, just very quickly insert the right one, use their name, and move on. Realize that trans employees may not be comfortable being out as trans, even if they're out in their private life. They may not be ready to come out to the general office. They may not be ready to be out to everyone. And that doesn't mean that they're ashamed. It doesn't mean that they're less trans. It really just means that, it's not everyone's business what their medical diagnosis is. It's also important to realize that not all trans employees, have a supportive home environment. So, a lot of the statistics we spoke of earlier, they affect adults and children alike. So they may come from a home where they can't talk about their gender identity, or they're asked to hide who they are, or maybe they're not even invited to family functions at all anymore. So when you talk to trans employees about their home life, just be cognizant that it may not be a story you are emotionally prepared to hear. If you hear any bullying amongst staff members or amongst colleagues, address it. Report it. Be the person to say, "Hey, that's not cool." It's really meaningful when cis people will stand up for trans people and take the burden off of trans people to always be advocating for themselves, because it can be very exhausting, especially if bullying is something that they have experienced in the past. They may not feel safe addressing it again. They may just want to keep their head down and be quiet and continue to face that abuse because they're worried about keeping their job, or they're worried about being labeled the problem trans person, and they just want to go to work, get through the day. If you're able to provide resources, be that safe person. Make sure that people know that it's okay to ask you questions, and if you don't know the answers, that you'll find out. And feel free to reach out to Trans Ohio or other organizations if there's a question that you get that you don't know the answer to. Just feel free to pass on our information. If you make a mistake, just move on, because you will make mistakes, and I still do too. We're all human beings. We'll continue to learn. The important thing is to start where you are, and when you learn better, do better. When we're dealing with trans clients and trans patients, realize that they're not just trans people. We all hold multi identities, and we're multifaceted human beings. Gender identity may be a very large part of someone's personal identity, especially when they are just coming out. But for by and large, gender identity is the smallest part of who a trans person is. So it may not be all they want to talk about. It may be the very smallest part of them. So be open to learning from every trans person you talk to, even if you think you already understand their story and what they're going to say. Let people tell their own stories. It's always good to normalize talking about pronouns by leading with your own pronoun. But if you're unsure about pronouns, it's okay to just use names and avoid using pronouns altogether. Uh, Also, always use preferred names if you know it, even if there has been no legal name change. You do this with your friends already. You use nicknames, so don't make people give you legal documentation that they've changed their names before you respect what their name is. That's just basic common courtesy. I also will always encourage people to use indicators of safe spaces. There are buttons, stickers, ribbons, that kind of stuff that you can put up and display in your offices, on your badges, on your person, necklaces and bracelets and such. But that's a personal decision whether or not you want to display those kind of things. I always think it's helpful, but you can be a safe person even if you don't have a safe space badge on the outside of your door. What's important is the actions that you take, and that people realize that you really are a supportive friend and an ally to the community. Another good thing is always make sure patient information is updated and the records are correct. So if name has changed, if gender has changed, make sure that's updated. And that's important for insurance, but also just for accurate records. Some ways to be an ally to the general community, is just remembering that gender matters to all of us. It really influences how people interact with us and how we interact with others. But don't forget that gender is really on a spectrum, and it can be fluid for a lot of people. So when we're talking about gender, try not to forget non-binary people, gender fluid people, and people who don't identify either as just male or female. So get outside that binary either or thinking. It's also always good to talk to other providers, and even your providers, about whether or not they treat trans people, whether they accept trans people, and if not, why not? And it's good to have those conversations as allies. Again, always support legislation that protects people, and always supports legislation that furthers, equality. And make your opposition known to anti-trans, anti-LGBT, anti-critical race theory, these bills that are going to negatively impact minority people. Make sure you voice your oppositions to the people who matter, to the people who can make those changes, to our lawmakers. Also, it's good to speak out about those injustices in your everyday life when you can see it. Just be an ally, even if it's off Facebook and no one's looking. It's always important to realize that trans people specifically face a lot of disparities still that we can, as allies, stop. I think I've run out of time here, y'all. It's 2 o'clock. I appreciate you. I can stay for as long as you need if we have extra questions, but I will not be offended if you have to drop off and get back to work or get on with your day. I really appreciate you joining me. Again, my email is james@transohio.org. You feel free to send me any questions about anything. Always here to educate.
Thank you, James, so much for being a part of part 2, if you will, of our cultural competency here. And yeah, if folks have questions, please feel free. You can turn on your mic and ask questions or drop them in the chat. I'm interested in knowing, just personally, James, are you currently, like, as an attorney, involved in some of these cases that are going on at the state? That's what I was thinking about the whole time. I was like, oh, maybe you're involved, you're
Yeah.
hands-on.
Yes. I can't talk about a lot of it actually, but
Sure.
I've been involved in writing some legislation that has passed and some that hasn't. I've also represented trans clients and been an expert witness in some cases that involve discrimination as a personal attorney. And also, Trans Ohio has written some advisory opinions. We've written some front of the court briefs for some pretty big cases. We also send information to lawmakers on a regular basis, and we've been involved with the birth certificate case and with the passport cases for as long as they've been going. So Ohio's birth certificate win that just came this past year, we've been involved at an organizational level for 10 years, which is a long time, y'all. that started before I was even involved, and it's really an exciting win. But it's important to frame that in, we at the federal level have been pushing for the Equality Act for 30 years. And for 30 years, it's been consistently reintroduced with some slight changes, but we're dealing with the same kind of legislation that in the 70s could have passed. So why why in 2022 are we still pushing back on just basic rights at a federal level? I don't know, but yes, I am involved in a lot of different things that I can't really get into.
I completely understand. And I think it's just exciting that, you are our presenter and you're so directly involved and hands-on grassroots, you're in the thick of it, advocating for folks.
You've
And
probably seen my face if you watch the Ohio channel. I've been to a couple different hearings now.
nice. Well, we know you personally. We'll be on the lookout. So
we also through Trans Ohio do the Ohio Name Change Legal Clinic. It's every month, the second Wednesday, and it's free help for trans folks or non-binary folks with updating in identification documents, or if they have any other legal questions. So that's ongoing, and I helped start that in 2016, back when there was a very real fear that the administration under President Trump was going to restrict passport access to trans people. We thought that they were going to require letters of surgery before you could change your documentation, which wasn't the case at the time and isn't the case now. But we were watching that. So we started the Legal Name Change Clinic to start teaching people what their rights were and to help them update their documents, because, it should be easy and you shouldn't need an attorney, but it can be very overwhelming and the legal system is not user friendly. And it's really great that, some years later now, I can't do math, but in 2022, we've handed out, I can't even mention how much legal fees and financial assistance, and we've just last month helped our 500th person. So
wow.
we're making some real changes, at least at a individual level.
Everyone counts. That's baby steps count too. That's what I always say. Everyone counts. There is a question. It looks like over in the chat. So why do we have to place it in the paper for my child's name to change? Does that open the door for people to come forward and speak out against him changing genders?
That is a good question, and it's important to note that that law has changed. So historically in Ohio, anyone changing their name for any reason had to publish in a newspaper of general circulation that they were changing their name. And the purpose of that was for creditors and for people who could object to your name change. So there was an old belief that people could move to a different state, change their name, marry someone else, get a new job, outrun their debts, outrun their crimes, be a new person, live a new life. It's 2022. Your social security number follows you forever. No one is ever gone to an Ohio name change hearing and objected on the basis of creditor. And on the basis of outrunning crimes. So recently that statute has been updated. You no longer have to publish by requirements. There are some counties in Ohio that are still asking for name change publication. And I'll be honest, on a personal note, I think that's to get the legal fees for it because it's an additional cost. There's really no legal requirement for it anymore. So if your court is requiring that, come to the Ohio Name Change Legal Clinic, and we can help you with a motion to waive publication. It may require an additional hearing on that motion, but most often it's just granted because, even under the Ray case that we had in Ohio, it was the birth certificate case, we talked about publication in that, and that publicizing transgender people's names, their full previous name, their full legal name, and their address was unnecessarily putting them at increased risk of physical harm, especially given the political atmosphere. And unfortunately, we're still in a political atmosphere where that's true, depending on the counties and where people are living. So the good news is you don't have to do that anymore. But if you are in a court, if your probate court is asking that, yeah, come seek the advice of an attorney. If you can't afford one, the Ohio Name Change Legal Clinic is free.
Good to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Rachel, I have a question, and I know a couple people actually emailed me directly to mention this too. Is there anywhere in particular, James, that you recommend us look to get those kinds of stickers or buttons that can represent being a safe space or being a safe person to talk to? Is there a specific place you could turn to?
Yeah, a lot of the trans groups in Ohio actually sell them. So if there's a support group near you, I would reach out and ask if they have any safe space stickers. But you can buy them from Etsy anymore. You just Google it. RainbowDepot.com has a bunch of flag stickers and like paraphernalia. You can lanyards and such. I always prefer the ones without symbols on them because I just think they're outdated. The ones that have like the male, female, and trans symbol on them, that's not really necessary. We all know what the rainbow means. We all know what the trans flag is. But there's a lot of different styles out there, and they've changed a lot over the years. So yeah, just get one that's you think is nice. And what's good about those stickers is most people don't notice them, but the people who are looking for them see them, and they know that you're a safe person.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions for James before we let him go about his day and weekend? We appreciate you coming back for part 2. Thank you so much.
I do have one last thought. So April is Minority Mental Health Month, right? And on the CDC website recently, the administration published some statistics about LGBT mental health, especially among youth. And they found between 43 and 47% of LGBT youth have increased depression, anxiety, and thoughts of suicidality. And that's increasing as the pandemic is going on. The website is titled something like LGBT health. There's no mention of trans people in that document on that website. So even though it says LGBT, it's LGBT specific. And the reason for that is we don't have studies on trans people. The largest study on trans health and mental health is done by the National Center for Transgender Equality. So it's a trans-run trans survey, and it does have the best results on it because it's a community-driven set of data. But the data we have is from 2015, and it's outdated now. So is the mental health of trans kids specifically worse now? Yes. Because of the pandemic? Yes. Because of these anti-trans bills? Oh my gosh, yes. And it's really, I think, just relevant that U.S. doesn't take that information on the census. We don't do wide data collection on that. So we don't have that information. So when you hear lawmakers saying such and such numbers of trans people, like take that with a grain of salt because they're usually making those numbers up because those studies aren't done, especially when it comes to trans people detransitioning. There's a misleading data point out there that a large number of transgender youth will end up not being trans. They'll grow out of it, and that study that's not what that study was. It's been debunked, but that's the stat that these lawmakers are running with, and that's the push behind these anti-trans bills. I know mental health is important for all of us, but especially when we're talking about minority folks, because it's especially hard these days when we're talking about anti-critical race theory bills. Being a Black person in America and in Ohio is increasingly difficult, especially for Black trans people. They are just the targets of so much hate and discrimination needlessly. And I really want to point out that there's a lot of movement at local school boards now where concerned groups are going in to ask school boards to change the policies on sports participations and for restroom usage. And they are largely attacking trans people of color and their children. We're talking about adults going in and telling, kids that they can't use the bathroom. And that is just, my opinions on that. Unnecessary and really just cruel.
Yeah, I can't imagine, and I feel for those kids that are, the struggle's already real to begin with, right? And just understanding what's happening for yourself. And then you've got, like you said, these adults kind of coming at these kids with, just being venomous and, not really appreciating where one individual is coming from. I had a conversation earlier about the idea of emotional intelligence, and I feel like many people don't have that. They can't appreciate or understand someone else's, point and of view and their feelings about things. And so,
Mhm.
what they don't understand, they just kind of spew things at,
Exactly. I wish we talked about mental health more openly, because the way we talk about self-care, it's always take a bubble bath. But I'll tell you, trans kids can't take a bubble bath and wash away the transphobia that they are facing in their daily lives. So it's really not about self-care. It's about community care and coming together and taking care of, our own communities and our allied communities. So making sure the best of us, can continue to be being able to look after everyone else. And I appreciate you all being here. I know this is an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of folks, and it can be difficult and confusing. So it's always really heartwarming for me to see folks who are, here welcoming education and opening, their understanding about talking about people who they may not understand. Like I said, we all have gender identities. You just may not have to think about it as often.